Hello, 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 hello. I am Mandisa Moore-O'Neill, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the executive director at CHLP, Center for HIV Law Policy, also a Black feminist and a strategist, and I am so excited for this conversation. So excited. Let's just get right into it. Folks are going to introduce themselves, but first, let's ground us in what is bringing us to this day. So, as we know, this is the second annual HIV is Not a Crime Awareness Day. And this panel is focused on Black women and HIV criminalization. So, to start us, I think it's important to ground us in the Combahee River Collective statement, which was based on a group of Black women, Black feminists in the 70s who wrote a groundbreaking statement that is still being used and understood this very day. I'm going to start from section 2 and just read an excerpt. Our politics initially sprang from the shared belief that Black women are inherently valuable, that our liberation is a necessity, not as an adjunct to someone else's because of our need as human persons for autonomy. This may seem so obvious as to sound simplistic, but it is apparent that no other ostensibly progressive movement has ever considered our specific oppression as a priority or worked seriously for the ending of that oppression. Merely naming the stereotypes attributed to Black women, whether that's mammy, sapphire, bulldagger, let alone cataloging the cruel, often murderous treatment we receive, indicates how little value has been placed upon our lives during 4 centuries of bondage in the Western Hemisphere. We realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolve from a healthy love of ourselves, our sisters, I'll add siblings, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and our work. This focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed working to end somebody else's oppression. So taking those words, let's just sit with that for a moment. And let's talk about how that's applicable in this conversation. So for this first question, I want to start with Venita and Kamara and Jada. What is HIV criminalization and how does it connect to other justice movements? And please introduce yourself when you first start talking.
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Jada Hicks. I'm a staff attorney at the Center for HIV Law Policy, where Mandisa is our executive director. I'm so happy to be here today. I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of what HIV criminalization is and then turn it over to Kamara and Venita. So HIV criminalization is the creation of new criminal laws and increased penalties targeting specifically people diagnosed and living with HIV for conduct that is either legal or less severely punished for individuals who have not been diagnosed with HIV. So this can include anything from laws that mandate HIV testing for persons arrested or convicted of specific offenses. Typically, we see this with sex offenses and sex work for the purposes of creating increased charges or increasing punishment. And I think like the more appropriate question is, how is HIV criminalization not connected to other movements? It's all intertwined. We are all the same. It's so intersectional that I don't even think you can separate it from everything else. But I'll turn it over to Kamara and Venita to share their thoughts as well.
I appreciate that, Jada, that grounding of the intersectionality, because I see criminalization as like another way to erase Black communities. For those that are with that campaign, this is a tool that they use to continue to oppress folks, and they're laws that target sex, they target pleasure. Like people, I'm a woman living with HIV. I forgot to introduce myself. I apologize. Kamara Laffrey, she, her pronouns with Sero Project. And I do come into this work as a woman, a Black woman living with HIV. And that is how I show up and how I try to operate and speak. So when I think about these laws and I think about the fears that I have of living in a state that enforces these laws like Florida, I see it as an erasure of who I am. And I know one thing in our community that we don't talk about as people living with HIV is our right to pleasure and how our pleasure is policed. And so these laws add to that and increase violence towards women. Well, anybody who's dating, and disclosure, because disclosure is not easy. Disclosure is really, really hard. So when you add in that that's my responsibility, but then there's a penalty attached to my disclosure, but I got to do it and figure out a way to be safe at the same time, that's oppression. That keeps me from like living in my full life as a woman living with HIV. And I can go on, but I want to hear from Mama V and others.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Venita Ray, and I too enter this work as a woman living with HIV in the South. I'm in Texas, and also coming from just a whole advocacy background. Was a practicing attorney at one point, and was diagnosed with HIV, and it changed the trajectory of my life because of all of the intersectional stigmatizing and oppressive ways that HIV is portrayed in the narrative around HIV in the media and in society and globally as well. So Jada, I think you and Kamara hit this right on the head. I would say it's another form of state structural violence and oppression that primarily impact folks who Black women, or another way to connect us in our vulnerability to the criminal justice system. We take a public health or chronic health issue and put it in a criminal justice context, which typically it serves three purposes: to punish, to detour, or to rehabilitate someone. And if my real crime is having a health issue is really a form of punishment. And so I usually call criminalization is having sex while positive, because no one in their right mind, society assumes, could want to have sex with someone living with HIV. So we must find a way to punish those who do it, because no one could possibly want to do that. So it's another, and the intersectional nature of it, this, clinic to prison pipeline, all of those disparities that are connected with our communities. HIV criminalization is one other form that is used that primarily impacts us. And my daughter asked me when I first got into this work, why should she care? And I said, well, daughter, someone could just say, I done it and I'm having to defend myself, whether they consented or not. And she was like, oh, hell no, Mom. So it became, criminalization matters whether you know it or not. And so thank y'all, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank y'all so much for talking about pleasure, talking about that this is not theoretical. It's actually having an adverse effect on people's lives every day, on our ability to live full, whole lives. I've not been in the movement for, as long as some of the folks on this call. I would say I've been in it about 12 years or so. And it's something about this conversation that seems historical in many ways, in terms of having this sort of conversation with all Black women, in a way that it makes you just want to ask the second question. And LaTrischa, if it's okay, I'm going to start with you. What is the importance of centering Black women in our work to address HIV criminalization?
Thank you, Mandisa. And I'm LaTrischa Miles. So glad to be with you. this afternoon, morning, or evening, wherever you are. But it is important to center Black women as we address HIV criminalization. I'll start with just a basic quote that I have used over and over again that says, when change starts with, that change does start with individuals who call out injustice when basic rights are being violated. And this has been my motivation. Human rights are being violated with these HIV criminalization laws. And it doesn't matter how you've contracted HIV. I am also a woman that is living with HIV. So, of course, these laws heavily impact, what I do. And it doesn't matter, as I was saying, how you contracted it. But what does matter is that we all have the right to life, liberty, and happiness. And this is what these laws are infringing on. Centering and including Black women in the work of criminalization, as I mentioned, is very important. And I'll just give my top three. And that is that we acquire HIV at a much higher rate. There's an increased risk of violence, sexual assault, and trauma when it comes to Black women. And then the collateral impacts of criminalization. And I'll just briefly go into these because I want to hear from other women as well. But when we look at the higher rates that women can contract HIV, we are 1 in 48 African-American women. That's high. That will contract HIV in our lifetime. For Black women, when you look at new infections, we're 91% of infections when it comes to heterosexual contact. And when we think about our trans women, they are 62% higher. So those numbers tell the story. When it comes to violence, increased violence and trauma that Black women go through, we are already disproportionately affected by interpersonal violence. And criminalization, when women are forced to choose between their potential partner, if they disclose their status, or risk arrest if they do not disclose their status. And so, the threat of arrest is there. Especially when you think about coercion and harassment. I'm going to go and tell, whomever that you're HIV positive, and it's usually the authority. And when you think about women that are immigrants, refugees, what type of, protection do they have? None. The collateral impact of criminalization, of course, once you get into the criminal justice legal system, it can be used as justification for accessing housing, employment, healthcare. So it impacts the family. And, being in this movement and having Black women center our work in this movement is paramount because of how it affects us.
Whew. Thank you for sharing your top three. In terms of it just really expanded the conversation, based on racist stereotypes, on legacies of a misogynoir, we're often seen as the perpetrators of violence, when in actuality, we are the survivors, and that gets lost in these conversations. If there are others who would like to add, why is it important? Why is it integral to not only include, but to also center Black women in this work?
I will jump in and add one. Thank you, LaTrischa, because you brought up some stuff for me personally of like what got me into this work. But I'm a firm believer that when you trust Black women, when you support Black women, when you pay Black women, the world follows, and we're able to like heal everyone. The thing when I think about when I think about these laws and how they impact the Black women that I know and the conversations that we have, these laws don't touch into consideration. And I know women that are very proud of themselves and their treatment journey of, I go to my doctor, I do my labs, I disclose to my partners, I use protection, so on and so forth down the list, to do all these things only to know that at any time, somebody can just say, oh, they never told me.
Right.
So even in the public health eye, when we're doing what we're scripted and mandated and told to do, we're still at risk of violence. And when you listen to Black women about how they're impacted by that and listen to us about how we say what the changes need to be, that's when these changes are actually going to become impactful for everyone, not just us. So that's my 2 cents on that. Very grateful for this conversation, because this is.
Whew. I want to add to that, Kamara, because I think you are right on. First of all, I think only we can tell our own story. So you can't talk about the journey of Black women and our relationship to any of these disparities or these intersectional social justice issues or oppression without hearing from us. Only we can tell our own story. And even though I appreciate the data and the numbers, the data without the stories is violence. The data without context is violence. Only a couple things. So, what impacts Black women the most impacts the whole community. And I think LaTrischa and Kamara both alluded to this. So when we tell the story, we're telling the story of our kids. It's an impact on our ability to mother, to parent, to work. All those stories that are tied together in that intersectional way that Jada started out with. People closest to the issue are also closest to the solution. So if we're not talking and if we're not sharing how we're impacted and what this looks like from our perspective, the ideas are theoretical. The solutions are theory. They're just, I don't want to use the word intervention because I get tired of hearing those kind of terms. That intervention, I want a solution. I can intervene if given the right options. And then lastly, I'll say historically, society has sought to control the reproductive ability of Black women, from slavery, from the early days. So the story having Black women in a conversation that has anything to do with what we tend to kind of characterize HIV criminalization being about sex, but it really isn't. It's about so much more. But it's one more of those structural violence and historical tools that's been used to control Black women's ability to produce or not produce, or to consent or not consent. So I just think if we're not in this conversation, the conversation is not being really had.
Well, it's not the conversation if we're not in it. Just thinking of what you just said, Venita, I'm going to take a moderator's privilege and kind of skip ahead in the questions and really focus on this part about data and humans. Like so much in this work, especially with CHLP, as a research organization and often engaged like with others, it can be so much data, so much numbers that it becomes easy. And let's be real, in terms of the academy, these institutions often encourage this. It can be so much focus on the data, on the numbers, that it can be easy to forget that that is based on humans, on a lived experience. And that the lived experience is actually at the center, not the other way around. The lived experience always informs the data, not the other way around. So based on that as a reality, what insights, what lessons would you like to share from your experience around, like, in this work? Whoever wants to start, please jump in.
I think it's important to always center people in this movement. It is very easy to get caught in this numbers game of data works. We know they'll listen to data, but that isn't always the case. We know, and we've seen in certain states, when we come with data and we come with facts and statistics, it doesn't do anything to move these legislators to change their minds. And so I think being able to put a human face with the data, with the numbers, is so vital and important for this work. To hear people's stories about how this affects their everyday lives is important. To hear the fear that, our communities are living with, because they can be subject to prosecution at any moment. And to think like you are literally fighting for your life in the courtroom. That is something that they need to understand. And, I think it's easy to say too, like, oh, you can prove disclosure, they have affirmative defenses. And it's like, no, you have to deal with the fact that you already are in the carceral system. You've been charged. You have to have a lawyer. You have to deal with whatever media comes with that. Like, these are things that need to be grounded within these statistics that legislators need to hear from us and policymakers need to hear from us. I just think it's so important to keep that rooted and centered in the conversation of what it really is like to live with HIV and live with HIV in this day and age, not with this outdated 1980s idea of HIV that I feel like really permeates throughout the state legislatures that we work in.
I want to, Jada, thank you for that. I want to add to that because the optics around this 1980s idea, and this is not to like throw any shade at anyone's lived experience that's gone through the beginning of the epidemic and is still here. Hats off to you, and I'm grateful you're still here. But when you look at who was in the media represented in the beginning of this epidemic, again, the erasure of Black folks. We weren't being seen, we weren't being talked about, but we were dying. And then you fast forward to all these laws and policies got implemented in response to all those, the fear and the confusion and the need for research and treatment response. And now we're in 2023 with laws that haven't been touched since 1986, 85. And I really appreciate that we even structured this conversation with not starting with a statistic. We started with talking about value and humanity. And I am grateful for that because we often do get stuck in that. And then we start strategizing and building movements instead of focusing on the people that need to be brought into the movement, because can they join the movement or do they have to fight for their life? And both things can happen at the same time, but how are you equipping and supporting and loving and healing in that process? Healing is the biggest thing that I've learned through this, of like hearing the data and hearing how folks that are making these policies are making decisions. They're making decisions based off of data, but they don't know me. They don't know that I'm an amazing Black woman and I live a very beautiful, full life. I'm a mother. I do amazing things. Like, they don't know Venita, they don't know LaTrischa, but they're making legislative decisions that are impacting our lives. So I really appreciate the grounding that the data is important, but it is not the only piece to this. We're not going to get to the end of this just by looking at graphs and charts.
Yes. So glad that you were bringing those things up, Venita, about telling our story. I have testified before the Missouri legislative committees, starting out with the Health Commission and ending up with the Justice Committee. And I remember the first time I testified, I told my story. They were only going to give us maybe 10, 15 minutes at tops because their attitude was, this is people living with HIV, and they didn't even call it that. These are people living with AIDS. And they're dying, and they were talking as if Ryan White was still alive. And I'm like, what? These folks are writing our laws, and they don't have a grasp or a great understanding of HIV 101 or the science of HIV or the fact that people are living long, strong, thriving with HIV. And I told my story and, just gave some examples. I'm a runner. And I said, runners, when they run long distances, they have a tendency to spit. And in your law, it has the fact that spitting and biting is an exposure to HIV. And so I could be a rest at the finish line. And, I could just see their eyes getting bigger and bigger of, hey, we didn't sign up to hear about all of this, but she's giving us some knowledge here. What I walked away with or what we walked away with, because it was a committee, was another visit, because we want more information. We want more material, because they didn't have the knowledge. But what pulled at their heartstrings was the stories that they were hearing from the women and men that were HIV positive. That pulls at people's heartstrings more than the data.
LaTrischa, I'm so glad you said that. I wanted to just make a couple points here to this, because I love Mandisa when the lived experience should inform the data, not the other way around. We get the data, we talk about the data, and then they still go to conversations without humanizing the data to come up with solutions, right? So it's just so crazy. And some of the lessons I've seen it is just a numbers game. Everybody wants to dress it up to make it sound good. It's an acronym game. If we can be PLHIV, we're not people. So humanizing us is important. And I think a lot of what this is about is changing hearts and minds, because I'm just outright angry that we're even having to talk about, you'd rather lock me up than give me a pill, in 2023, that we're even having this conversation. So hearts and minds, I've talked to legislators, district attorney, hey, spit doesn't transmit this, but, and have them shut me down. Like, I don't want to hear the truth. We're going to do this no matter what. We have a legislator in Georgia a couple months ago that's still saying maybe we should be quarantining them because we can't tell them people apart. Talking about people living with HIV. When we just had the National HIV/AIDS strategy came out recently, late last year, and it had this line in there that said, all the numbers, if we looked at the numbers, have improved for every group except for Black women. Why is there just it could have been a footnote in there? And how is that not driving policy and the conversation and resources because of that? I don't get it. I too have testified in front of groups, in front of legislatures, and been the only one with skin in the game, which I'll say the only one testifying who is actually living with HIV, that what you are doing could potentially impact, right? And that's not easy for everybody, because, even in 2023, folks think we've come so far, and they'll try to analogize HIV to diabetes, which people, if you're doing it, stop it. It is not, okay? It's not the same. That I'm the only one sitting there testifying that what you are doing, who this could actually impact, because it's always somebody else's problem or them othering us, So I do think the lessons we've learned is that if we don't change some hearts and minds and build some champions, because we, meaning the HIV community, cannot in the practice of criminalization, because I want to also note that criminal laws are only one way that this is happening. Written criminal laws, this is happening even in the absence of criminal law. So it's not only just a law thing, it's a policy and practice, because we still need a boogeyman around a health condition. And who's the best boogeyman but another Black person? So thank y'all for this conversation.
Oh, thank y'all for bringing it exactly where it has needed to go. Oftentimes it is my experience that folks say the things that they think someone wants to hear, which may or may not be the truth of the matter. And so one of the frameworks that I learned from other Black women is the importance and the necessity of speaking truth to power. And that's what we've had so far. And I know that's what we'll continue to have. One of the things that I'm thinking about is at the start of the quote that we shared, its first sentence said something that still blows my mind. I've read this text umpteen times. Black women are inherently valuable. What I like about this quote is it saying that we are inherently valuable, which means that we're valuable not because of our labor, not because of what we do for others, which is often uncompensated or undercompensated. We are inherently valuable, like we are valuable because we exist, because we breathe, because we are. If we do nothing else, we are still worthy. Unfortunately, I think we know how that isn't always a sentiment expressed in the dominant culture. My question is, how do you sustain yourself in this work? How do you stay doing this work? Because y'all didn't just start in this work last year.
I appreciate the question. I always get emotional when I have to like focus and like share with others about what it takes to stay in this work. Part of it is the stories. I've not experienced criminalization directly, but I know people who have. I know folks on the sex offender registry list as a penalty in their state, and I talk with them and have cried with them about the different things that they have to experience and still advocate. Well, they choose to, they don't have to. So what grounds me in that is holding space for folks while they're waiting for the laws to change, while they're waiting for the data and the strategies and whatever's happening. That's a part of it. Another part of it, and this is not just because I'm here today, but being in a space with other Black women, so being surrounded by the representation of others that are in this work helps ground me. It helps remind me that one, I'm not alone. Two, this is absolutely an important issue. And thirdly, that my voice does have power, especially when it's added with other women that look and live like me. So those are things that ground me, that are outside of the work. I have to be honest, like making sure that I'm finding time away from that, making sure I'm in spaces where I'm not talking about HIV. I can't turn this off. Like, it's not my 9 to 5, like my friends think. They want to like do happy hour and like, yeah, let's not talk about where I'm like, well, my work is my life, literally. Like when I do labs, that's advocacy. When I show up for a webinar, that's my life. So it's twofold. So I'm always making sure I'm finding space for the things that keep me sane, such as arts, being in plants, going to farmers market, but then also sitting in my feelings. That's the last thing I'll say, because a lot comes up in this work. There's a lot of heavy stuff in this work. And sometimes, I can just push on and go to the next Zoom and go to the next webinar, but sometimes I got to sit in that. And sometimes I got to process, how is this impacting me? Is my ego in the way? And what to do with that. And I've been learning that through women like this panel today of, Kamara, sometimes just step back. You don't have to be in that spot. You don't have to take in this information. So those are a combination of the things. Whatever works on the day I need it is what I pull from my toolbox.
Yeah, thanks, Kamara. You mentioned some things that help and sustain me as well. And it can be difficult. I founded the HIV Justice Coalition here in Missouri, and that was back in 2011 when I founded the coalition as a solo person, the only one that was interested in the law, because CHLP had contacted me and said, you got a problem in Missouri. And I'm sitting there, well, what's the problem? And, they said HIV criminalization. And they were generous to come out. And I had, a library full of folks, because I held it there and introduced HIV crim to my community. And so that was back in 2011. So what did it require of me? Much patience, because the governor did not sign our modernization bill into law until 2020. So I had to keep this going. The good thing about having a sustainable coalition is that you do what? You realize that you can't do it all. You can't do it all yourself. You have to plan some self-care in there. And by all means necessary, you need to recruit folks, people that are leaders, that are advocates, that are allies, that are passionate about this, because I've crisscrossed Missouri and it's hard. And unless you have some folks that are also invested, it's difficult to get the message out there. I was reading I don't know if it was a quote or someone was telling me, because you got to do a lot of mentorship and education, even with those folks that you do recruit. And they said, if you educate a man, you educate an individual. But if you educate a woman, you educate a nation. And I thought, wow. And, you know, going through those trying times, here they call me the mother of the HIV crim movement, just because I, you know, and I'd only started it, but stayed with it until I saw change happen. And I'm going to say also, knowing that you're educating a generation, you know, it's your coworkers, and hoping that they experience, you know, something better in the next thing that needs to be moved up the ladder. So I'll stop here for some other comments that some of the other women may have.
I think I wanted to kind of echo the sentiments that Kamara shared. Is really the people. And let me say, this is coming from someone that had to step away from the work for a minute. And what brought me back was the people. And I feel like just being able to, you know, I had advocates thank me for the work that I've done, and being able to work with them and see the movement that we've made and how it changes their lives. That has what been really, truly what has sustained me in this work. And in that same vein, having colleagues like the women on this panel that I can turn to in moments where I need someone to lean on, maybe someone to vent to, that really are going to understand the specific issues of being a Black woman in this space, because it is difficult, right? This is difficult work. It's difficult to not be tokenized. It's difficult to not get talked over. It's difficult to not be made into the angry Black woman. Like, those are all things that everyone on this panel has to deal with every day, just for existing and doing their job, just for showing up. And so I think having the ability to name those things and have other people understand what I'm going through and what I'm talking about, and kind of push me to keep going, has really, really helped me. And, you know, outside of work, I feel like really just my family, doing things that I enjoy. It can be something as simple as, you know, the other weekend we took my daughter to like a petting zoo, and I think I had more fun than her. Like, I was like, I get to pet baby animals, like, sign me up. Finding ways to decompress outside of work, things that are enjoyable for you, because, you know, I think it's easy sometimes to carry this work everywhere you go. I'm not a person with lived experience. I can't understand that struggle. I can't. I'll never understand. I won't understand that struggle. But what I can understand is having some of this like keep you up at night. Like, really, honestly and truly, having people tell you that they don't care about something that you're so passionate about, or presenting them with facts and literally having them just ignore what you're saying as if you didn't even just say it. It can really get to you. And so I think finding ways and different outlets, like I love music, listening to music, having dance parties, like that is something that I do to just kind of decompress, as silly as stupid, but it really helps me. And I think really being able to have that has pushed me along in this work.
Thank y'all so much. This was an important question because a part of the racialized, sexist stereotypes of Black women is as workhorses, right? Like, it was like, we are there to work on behalf of everyone else, and that our own needs, and that it's selfish if we say no, or say, I'm actually putting me in priority, so I'm not going to attend, you know, this event or this meeting. So for me, it was important to ask and to hear about how do we sustain ourselves in a world that sometimes isn't invested in us and in our wellness and our well-being. I also am curious about, where is your assessment of the HIV criminalization movement? What are your hopes and dreams for it? And yes, that sounds frou-frou, and sometimes I can be frou-frou, but sometimes in this work, it's always the crappy things that are happening, right? It's always like the ways that we are experiencing oppression. And my experience is it isn't always space to talk about our dreams, to even think that we can have them, to think about what we want in this movement. So it was important to ask that question and to really hear assessments of the movement. So I'm going to start with Alleen. Please introduce yourself and share your thoughts on your assessments of this movement.
Hi, everyone. This is Alleen King Carter from Shreveport, Louisiana. I'm living in 3D, Capacity Builders International. In the move, I feel that in the movement and what we have going on in the movement is so good to have a movement for Black women. We as Black and brown women, we as women go through so many things, physically, mentally, and then on top of that, we have to deal with if we have children or significant others taking care of everybody else, and sometimes we neglect ourselves. Now, as far as the movement itself, if we could just go on and start having more people living with HIV and upper or doing the work. Also, people always say, well, if all you do is that HIV work, well, when we become one day where we won't have to do the work and HIV is no longer such a pandemic, then I won't have to keep talking about it. But I feel that if people were more open to telling their stories, more open to talking to people, more open to not being so ashamed of having HIV or whatever's going on, I think it would work out so much better.
So I guess for me, my assessment, I think it angers me, and I have no problem being called the angry Black woman, because I am, and I'm the loving Black woman, and I'm all these other things too. That that in 2023 we still are having this conversation, but my assessment is that I really feel like the criminalization is being talked about at a federal level a little bit more, and at a state level more than I've heard in a number of years. I first entered this in probably 2015, and now, on World AIDS Day, President Biden mentioned criminalization from the Rose Garden for the first time that I'm ever aware of. Now, just talking about it took us nowhere, but y'all know from a strategy standpoint how you leverage something said, and now the Office of National AIDS Policy, criminalization is one of its priorities. Although, even though criminalization is a state issue, but the federal government, it kind of started it when it mandated this for jurisdictions to get right and white funding. So they have a role in showing some leadership and using that their funding stream to do something about it as well. So, and then I also, some of my assessments is that we continue focusing on. So one of the things I hear in abolitionist movements and all these movements is that we got to focus on the root cause. Jada started us off talking about this as intersectional. Criminalization is on one form of structural oppression that we're dealing with. So to me, after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and things that we were talking more about systemic racism, and jurisdictions have, declared it a public health issue. We've got to keep pushing on that. We've got to keep pushing on that, because we can't get away from the root cause. Remember, HIV is a symptom of the issue that's going on. And so I want to hear criminalization talked about in across every movement. You know, I remember in probably 2016 or something at a PWN conference, and it's talking about aging, and I was wondering, why am I on this? And there was a table talk that was about sex. Well, there was no pleasure talk. It was all fear-based conversation at that table. So, you know, my hopes and dreams is I demand the right to pleasure and sex. I demand the right to be a sexual being and still be seen that way. And that when I went to that table thinking we were going to have us a little freaky conversation, and the whole conversation was about fear. There was no humanness to that conversation. So I see pluses and minuses in the movement. I see us talking more about root causes and disparities and racism and oppression and inequities, and which is good. And we've got some focus at the federal level, and we've got some organizing going on. But I also know that we've got to continue to cross movement lines and include these issues in all policy discussions, not just an HIV discussion. We cannot do this work alone or in a silo. So I think we've got some good stuff going on, but I think, you know, and then to see, I got to say this, Mandisa, seeing you head of one of our national organizations that has been working on this, you know, to see Black women or women with lived experience or femmes or being put in leadership roles, you know, money, you know, resources, you know, we've got to bring our folks with lived experience and who can bring some humanity to the conversation and to the organizations that we're looking to lead this effort. And I'm seeing some of that happening, as well as I'm still seeing silencing and erasure going on in some of our organizations, and we're not speaking out against them as well as speaking against the system, and we need to do both.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question or not.
I think we see that with Kamara.
Definitely answered the question.
Too, I just wanted to shout you out. You know, you're also in a leadership position now at Sero. And so I think for me, you know, I haven't been in this movement as long as other women on this panel, but to see Black women in positions of power, I am so excited to see where this movement goes. And that is not in a way of like a savior, like, please do all the work, please. That's not where it is coming from. So let me also name that. I just think in this conversation, when we're talking about having a seat at the table, we have a seat at the damn table. And I literally, for the first time in this work, just feel, just proud to see where we are going. I want to see more of that. I want to see more Black and brown faces in positions of power within our coalition, speaking up and sharing their stories in a way that's like, hold up, this is affecting me and my community, my brothers and sisters, my friends. Like, we should be having those voices. And so I think that is important to name, but also, as Venita said, I think it's important to talk about these things. I want to see more action behind it. It's important. We've been saying for years that, you know, this is intersectional work. These are systemic issues that cross, and you can't talk about one without the other. And that's so true. But I want to see a little bit more action about that. Y'all, I would love to be out of a job. I know that sounds like silly to say, but put me out a job, please. Okay. Like, that's fine with me. It would be a cause to celebrate for me. Like, I would love to say, we have done such a great job that I don't even need to be here anymore. And so for me, like, that's where I want to see us go. That's where I want to see as a movement where we move towards.
Yeah. I'll be brief on the assessment. And like Venita was saying, I can say that when I got involved back in 2011, criminalization, now people know about it. They're talking about it. They are aware of it. And one of my hopes, of course, here in, you know, the furtherance of things that we need to do, and this is getting into the law a little bit, but, you know, with HIV enhancements, we need to do something with that. So in other words, our work is not finished, reducing the penalties from felony to misdemeanors. And as a Black woman, you know, recognizing the role that Black women play in this movement, and just being fair in the work that we do and what we deliver. And we're often the breadwinners. And so pay us, okay? Pay us for our work. Because, we're in it to win it. We're trendsetters, and, we can change some stuff when we are involved. The challenge, though, and I don't know if I wanted to mention just a little bit about that, is that HIV crim is different depending on where you live. And it is very specific. It's state specific. You have to determine what your strategy is going to be wherever you're based at in your state. And so, for example, some of these laws are specific criminal laws that's already written into it. And then others are just general laws like aggravated assault. And then Venita mentioned some of the federal laws because they've got skin in the game as well. Utopia for me would be getting rid of these laws. But we do know that once, those laws are out there, that is, extremely difficult. So we thought, with Roe versus Wade, but that's another day and another story. But I digress.
Thank y'all. Something else that this conversation, and Venita in particular, made me think of is the importance of Black women in leadership with full agency and power and not being tokenized. Because I think all of us have the experience at various points in our lives, unfortunately, of entering a space and seeing very quickly why we're here. And it's not because of your brilliance. It's because somebody needed to check off a box. So my hope, as well, is that we're in the leadership positions with the same agency that the people who came before had, and not suddenly, oh, now it's more funding restrictions. Oh, well, like when it was white-led, you didn't require 8 reports. It was 2 per year. Or, like when it was led by a white cis gay man, it was this much in the budget. Why is it half that? Because of this understanding, like that Black women can make anything out of $1.50. So also just expanding that it's not about us being tokenized, it's about us actually shifting power and transforming. So I just really thank y'all for bringing that into the conversation. And as we close, and again, closing, it doesn't mean that this movement ends. It means that this particular conversation ends. It's very clear that we're in this until it's done. But as we end this particular conversation, I would like to hear from each of you one last thought or statement to leave us with. What's one thing that you really want us to know?
I'll be really quick. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You can go ahead.
This connects to the previous question about an assessment. And I want to apply this to the whole HIV movement, not just the criminalization, because there's a term that folks are using called ending the HIV epidemic. And then there's a year that people attach to it, and that year keeps moving forward because we're not meeting it. And I sit back and I think about that, and I look at the folks who, more so like on your public health clinical spaces, they're like, I've been doing this for 30 something years. They talk about how long they've been in the fight, and I'm not knocking down anybody's commitment to this work. But in some ways, that's not a flex. If you've been doing this for a long time, but we're still having the same damn conversations. So my closing thought is, if you've been in this work for a long time, do you ever sit back and ask yourself, is there any part of that attachment to that commitment that is ego, that is holding you in the way, instead of making a way for somebody else to come forward or a group of people to come forward? And I think for me, that is an assessment of how we're bringing the representation of those who are impacted with lived experience into the decision-making spaces and into the leadership pathways that we were just talking about. So I really take to heart, even for myself as a woman living with HIV, if I truly believe that we're going to end this epidemic, what part of me needs to move out of the way and what part of me needs to grow so that we can actually accomplish that? Because I don't want to be having these conversations 40 years from now. I turned 41 this year. I don't want to be 80 having these same conversations.
And this is Alleen. This is my final thought. Whenever you say something about HIV and criminalization, everyone thinks it's someone else than what you're talking about. I feel that HIV affects everyone, including me. In closing, and I'll try and make it short. I was in a library me and my fiance, who had to register as a sex offender for non-disclosure of HIV. We were there with my grandkids, with my kids, and they put us out of the library. It made everybody around me upset, and it really upset me because they didn't know what they were doing as far as discriminating. So when you think that HIV criminalization just affects one person, it doesn't. It affects everyone in the home, everyone around, everywhere. So that's my final thought.
Wow, that was powerful. I guess building on Kamara, all this conversation about ending the epidemic, I've been in those conversations. I don't know what they really mean, to end HIV, but I'm clear about one thing. We can't educate, prep, prosecute our way out of this epidemic. We got to decide either we're going to deal with a public health issue and the root causes of it, or we just want to punish people for acquiring a disease. So you got to make a choice. Either you want to end it, whatever that means, you want to prevent it, or you want to prosecute. But you can't do all three. And we have to stop trying to maintain the status quo. Everybody wants to act like we're doing great and we want to celebrate. But I think we got to be more critical. And I think my last word I would say is that I am not a deadly weapon. I'm a person first. So, HIV gets characterized as my identity, but I am a woman first. I am a human being. The H in HIV is human. So I'm a woman living with HIV. So I am not a deadly weapon, as the Texas court has said. I'm a human being. And we need to really start thinking about the distinction between public health and criminal justice. They are not the same, and you can't solve one problem with the other. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to kind of go back to that previous question too, just a little bit, but there are a lot of programs and things that are out there, a lot of research to attempt to fix Black people. However, there's not enough focus, as Venita was saying, on fixing structural racism. Just being in this movement for a very long time, seeing some change in how long it took. The leadership is important, as Kamara was saying. And so hosting mentorship programs and things like that is important. And we did a fellowship here of some advocates and folks that we want to get into the movement. So that is important, is that you bring leaders on up through the ranks, because you're not going to be doing this forever. At least I certainly won't. But I want to follow my life's passion. I want to leave that with folks. Follow your life passion. Live well. I used to say that I want to count my years, but now I say I want to make my years count. So I'll end with that.
I feel like so many great things have been said that it's hard to, Venita, really, I mean, just amazing. My husband's family always cites this poem that says, keep it going. If you strike a thorn or a rose, keep it going. And it's all about persevering. And I would really like to see us all persevere to a point where HIV isn't criminalized, where it is treated as a public health issue. And when we say that, we really stand behind it. I would like to see us try to not operate from a place of fear. And I don't think that we always do, but sometimes it can creep in and it's hard not to. You know, I would really like to see a place in a world where HIV isn't treated as a death sentence anymore. And I know that we always say that, but to see people thriving with HIV and to see them doing this work day in and day out and fighting tirelessly really lights my fire to keep doing this work as well. And I hope that it also brings the change that we need regarding something that is a public health issue. I wish that the COVID pandemic had taught us more in terms of how to approach infectious communicable diseases in a way that was more understanding and encapsulating all of the public health approaches that we talk about. So I hope that we keep learning and we keep evolving as a movement. Kamara is right. I don't want to see us having the same conversation 40 years from now. I hope that we have evolved as a movement by then.
That's such a powerful place to end. I think everyone was able to say their last words, right? Okay, I thought so. Sorry. And Jada, actually, I think that quote comes from enslaved people who were running to freedom. You know, like my understanding of that quote is rooted in, like, if you thorns thistles, you know, you keep going. If a gun's at your back, keep going. Like, one of my favorite stories of Harriet Tubman is that when folks were fleeing to freedom, which is our birthright, of course, sometimes, you know, fear would come about. And Harriet Tubman was known to put a gun to your back and saying, you're moving forward, we're not going back. And, you know, folks would be like, well, that's mean. No, it's not. It actually isn't. That's actually love, putting that gun in your back and saying, we're going to keep forward together. So, like, that quote just made me think of that. This conversation is monumental and will continue, because it has to continue, because it was never just about this conversation. So as we close, just a thank you to AIDS United and their new initiative, Melanated Movement. Thank you for this conversation. Please follow them at ageunited.org/melanated-movement. I know they're on Instagram at Melanated Movement. It's a way to engage in the conversation. And thank you to each of you for being in this conversation and to speaking what was necessary for the power that we all have. And with that, we can say goodbye. Thank y'all.